So yesterday I posted a video where I gave the whole history of Israel from um, Abraham all the way up to the Barkatzba Rebellion. And if you were listening closely, you might have heard a few mistakes that I made. For example, I said that Antiochus was from the Ptolemaic Empire. He was actually from the Seleucid Empire. I said Abraham was 1,500 years before Jesus. It was actually more like 1,900 years. So there was a few mistakes that I made in there. And the reason is because I did it all off the top of my head. Now, of course, I could have gone through and fixed everything, but I decided to just leave it up there because the whole purpose, as I said at the beginning of this whole series, is just for me to get some practice speaking off the top of my head and being able to speak fluently and keep my train of thought and all that kind of stuff. It would defeat the purpose if I had these long detailed notes and outlines and stuff. So I'm trying to do this all off the top of my head. So I'm going to make mistakes, but hopefully the mistakes I make will just be in the minor details and not in the main things. So today I want to talk about more specifically about Messianic expectation. I talked about that briefly in yesterday's video, but I want to go into more detail today. I read this book called Judaisms and Their Messiahs, and it's a collection of essays by various scholars about Messianic expectation in the first century. And if you read this book, it becomes clear that Messianic expectation was all over the map. There wasn't any one Messianic expectation. And so, for example, there were some people who didn't believe in a Messiah at all. The Sadducees would have been among these groups because they didn't believe in any of the prophets or anything like that. Some people thought that the whole Messianic thing was over because that promise that God made to always that David's throne would last forever was contingent on David's sons being disobedient. Since they were not obedient, that promise is no longer applied. So there were some people who didn't believe in a Messiah at all. Some people believed that there would be two messiahs. The Essenes, for example, thought that there would be a Davidic messiah, a king, and a priestly messiah, somebody who would reestablish, the Aaron's line or the Levitical priesthood or something like that, the high priesthood. Some people thought these two things were combined in one person. Some of the differences in Messianic expectation have to do with the fact that some of the prophecies in the Old Testament are not obviously Messianic, but some people interpreted them that way, and maybe they are. And so, because there was all these ambiguous passages, there was, a lot of disagreement on what the Messiah would be or how it would turn out. And so, one of them was that one of them lumped Messianic expectation in with this thing that was said about Moses, that God said, I will raise up a prophet like you, or something like that. And so a lot of people thought that there would be this major prophet like Moses who would lead people back into the promised land and all this kind of stuff. And that was a kind of Messianic expectation. But what I want to do to try to avoid all these different ambiguities is focus on a particular strand of Messianic expectation that's relevant to Christianity. And that's the idea that there would be a son of David, a descendant of David, who would reestablish that throne and usher in all those promises. And there are a handful of passages that are just unambiguous Messianic passages. And these things form the core of the kingly Messianic expectation regarding a descendant of David. And so, as I said in the last video, this all originated from this promise God made to David, and you can see it in Second Samuel chapter 7, I think verse 15, but I'm not really sure. But it said that his throne would last forever. And then there were other prophecies where he said, Israel will never lack a man to sit on the throne of David. And then when Solomon became king, those same promises were repeated to Solomon. And so in Jeremiah 33, at the Babylonian exile in 587, when everything was destroyed, there was one last king, and I can't remember who it was. It may have been Jehoiakim, but I'm not really sure. But anyway, he was kind of carried off to Babylon. He was his eyes were poked out or whatever, and then I think he eventually died, and that was the end of David's line. That that whole thing came to an end. So some of the prophets started saying that God would fulfill his promise by restoring that throne at some point. In Jeremiah 33, it explicitly cites that promise in its messianic prophecy that there would be this Messiah, that there would be this eschatological king who would usher in all these things. So let me just give you a list of these. You can recognize these unambiguous messianic prophecies by the fact that sometimes it refers to this eschatological king as David himself. Sometimes it'll say a descendant of David, or a branch of David, or a righteous branch. Sometimes it'll say the root of Jesse. Jesse was David's father. And so it uses all these messianic titles. Even Son of God is a messianic title that you can see in certain passages. Because like there are passages in the Psalm that says to David, you will be my son and I will be your father, things like that. So, I mean, the phrase Son of God is used in different senses in the Old Testament. Sometimes Son of God refers to anybody that's a human being. Adam was the son of God. So anybody that's a son of Adam is a son of God. But it's also used in a more restricted sense. All Israelites were called children of God or sons of God or something like that. But the Davidic king, the Messiah, was called the Son of God in an even more special sense. And so Son of God is also a messianic title. Just the word branch, that shows up in Zechariah and other places, maybe possibly Micah. So let me just list a few of these passages, and then I want to summarize what they say, because there's a lot of overlap between these passages. They all essentially say the same things, and I don't have them all memorized, but it's basically, I think there's a passage in Isaiah 9. There's a big section in Isaiah chapter 11. I can't remember the verses, but I can give you the chapters, and they're not hard to find if you know the chapters. Isaiah 11, Jeremiah 23, Jeremiah 33, Zechariah 6, Micah 5, Zechariah 14, I think. I'm sure I'm leaving out some more. I think what I'm going to do is when I'm editing this video, maybe I'll just list them here. And so there's a bunch of common threads in all of these messianic prophecies. And they include things like when the Messiah comes, Judah and Israel. Remember when I was saying in yesterday's video that the exile had come to an end? Well, I was specifically talking about the exile, the Babylonian exile that just pertained to the Jews. Well, the coming of the Messiah is going to involve the reunion of Ezekiel 37. That's one I left out. In Ezekiel 37, you get this vision of the valley of dry bones, and all these bones take on flesh and come to life and everything. And then the interpretation that Ezekiel gives of this vision is that all of Israel, in other words, not just Judah, but Israel as well, both nations, they're all going to come out of the land that they were exiled into, and Judah and Israel are going to be reunited. And all these wonderful things are going to happen. In Isaiah 11, it talks about the lion laying down with the lamb. And these are like poetic descriptions of these wonderful conditions that are going to pertain, that involve like worldwide peace, prosperity, no more hunger, no more sickness. All these wonderful things are going to happen. So there's this massive return from exile that involves both nations, the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah. They're going to be reunited, and the throne of David is going to be reestablished. All of Israel's oppressors are going to be kicked out. They're going to be defeated. All of Israel's enemies are going to be defeated. But eventually, this is going to result in worldwide peace. And some of the ones in Zechariah, it talks about how the other nations are going to come to Israel to learn about Yahweh, and this peace is going to spread throughout the whole world. And so basically this means Israel is going to have national sovereignty, so they're not going to have anybody ruling over them anymore, and everything's going to be peachy, So I guess that's it, just the return from exile, the reunion of Judah and Israel, national sovereignty, the defeat of Israel's enemies, the return to the land. So they're going to get their temple back, their land back, their king back. All these wonderful things are just going to happen, and that's essentially Messianic expectation. In the first century, there were all kinds of movements, some of which were obviously Messianic. Some of them, they were quasi-Messianic, I guess you could say. Some of them were a little bit ambiguous. There was one guy who led a bunch of people out into the desert, and he kind of reenacted when Israel entered the Promised Land. They crossed the Jordan River, and he tried to reenact that. So he may have been seen as kind of like the prophet like Moses, which was one of the Messianic expectations. So there were some other ones. It kind of peaked around the time of the war. During the war that Jerusalem had with, the Jews had with Rome during 66 to 70, there were at least two people, if not three or four, who were all claiming to be the Messiah, and they all had followers, and they were fighting each other at the same time they were fighting the Romans. And then you had that last one, the Barkatzba Rebellion, where Simon Barkatzba was said to be the Messiah. And so that's basically, you can understand why Messianic expectation might have been pretty high in the first century, because it was during the years 6 to 66 in which these procurators, these Roman procurators, were ruling Judea directly, and they were constantly offending the Jews. So the Jews were feeling the weight of their oppressors during this time. And so naturally, they were yearning for some sort of deliverer, somebody that would come along and kick the Romans out and reestablish their national sovereignty and make everything wonderful again. And so the Christian movement was just one of these movements. It's unique in the fact that it survived the death of its leader, which I will get into later in this series. And that's all I wanted to say about Messianic expectation today. So basically, those are that forms the core of what the Davidic Messianic expectation was. This idea that, a descendant of David would come and reestablish the throne of David and usher in the fulfillment of all these promises that had been made and make everything wonderful again. And there you have it.